Did I check the batteries in here? Yes. Yeah. Good morning. Let's all, before we start, set your feet on the ground. Take a deep breath. And learn to lean into that. Learn that as a skill. You're going to need it. You're going to need it. I'm convinced, my friends, that the most valuable spiritual skill that we will learn for the future ahead of us is found from the book of James. Your anger does not produce God's righteousness. You will have plenty of opportunities to be outraged and angry. And if you stay in that place, you'll be of no good to anyone. So we'll have to figure out how to experience that, acknowledge that, and turn it into something else. I don't have the answers for how we do that yet. But
yeah, was that out of context?
That was a little bit out of the context of the class today, yes. Yeah. Right. So, last week we did a session on what does the Bible say about same-sex relationships. We did not really conclude that super well, so I kind of wanted to start off this morning asking if anybody has any questions that were left over from last week before we start this week. And I figured we'd have several, so we'll pass the mic around.
It was my understanding that holy unions were a thing before the Nicene Council, and so there were same-sex wedding type rituals that were already happening. So, quote-unquote, gay marriage is not a new thing for the 20th century.
So there's some evidence. John Boswell wrote a book on this, and there's some scholarly evidence that there were rituals in place. It's not. I think the best way to answer that is to say it's not as binary as we like to say things are, like that there was this time when this was not the case. So I was reminded of this in listening to a conversation with John Meacham, the historian on NPR, who said, we're under this illusion that like these are really bad times, and there was some other idyllic time when there weren't bad times. And when there wasn't controversy, when there wasn't struggle, when everything was clearly defined and everything was great. And that's just not true. Like, that's not a historical reality. Every time is complicated and has its complications. So we like to also say, well, there was this time in which gender norms were defined the way we define gender norms. And that's not true either. I mean, that's not even true within our own context. There's the truth that there's a dominant expression of that, and there are expressions that are outside of that typical framework, but that's not a universal kind of edict that happened. So there was a time. John Boswell does a really excellent job in sort of describing how that was a more amorphous moment in history before. My recollection is he doesn't lean so hard on Nicaea as being some sort of division line, but it certainly is from one sense in that the church, whatever we might call the church at that time, became merged with the empire pretty fully at Nicaea. And so any of these sort of extracurricular expressions or anything that didn't fall within the realm of what the empire wanted to express were squashed, beginning with Nicaea, certainly. And there was a much more uniform kind of expression of the way things are done. But yeah, there's the expression of queerness has been with us since the beginning of time, and it's certainly part of nature. You can't argue any other way. It is our cultural discomfort with that we see expressed in lots of different forms. That's not universal. Not all cultures have that aversion. So, does that answer your question?
I just got reminded last week of learning one of my Hebrew Bible class that there's a Jewish midrash regarding the story of Naomi and Ruth, how that can be viewed as a same-sex relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily sexual, but though it doesn't say it, but a definitely possibly romantic one.
Yeah, the book of Ruth is a very complicated book, and a lot of the expression around gender roles and social expectations and expressions are messed with in that book. So it's ironic if you've not read the book of Ruth. I mean, if you just sit down and read the book of Ruth, you may not catch all those cultural clues. You do have to have some understanding of, Ruth comes from an enemy tribe, and that's the first sort of step over the line, that Ruth is somehow made to be this heroine figure for her dedication, her loyalty. Basically, it's Ruth showing Hebrew values, Ruth, the non-Jew, showing Jewish values, is the large picture of that story. But also contained in that is Ruth's sort of acknowledgement of the gender and sexual morals and constructs of that age, and how she uses those, for survival, as a survival story. And Ruth apparently becomes so important that within Matthew's genealogy of Jesus, Ruth is mentioned. Matthew's genealogy of Jesus, which is supposed to, first of all, defies all of these things, because within Judaism, you're actually matrilineally defined. It's through your mother, but Jesus is tied through his patrilineal line, except in two places where it switches over to the matrilineal and then goes back to the patrilineal. Right? So it's just this weird, odd mix. Again, not as clearly defined as we would expect, or as we are often told.
Wasn't Ruth also kind of a pushback perhaps at the time they were mainstream Judaism, or the Hebrews were trying to say, well, you need to marry within your own tribe, and here she is outside the tribe, exhibiting those values, and it's like, oh yeah, and King David goes back that, so you want to badmouth King David too, because he's not pure.
Yeah, there's all kinds of arguments that go on within the Hebrew texts about, this is the other myth that we are offered. Oh, well, the Old Testament God is this way. Well, no, the Old Testament God is lots of ways. And you look at the stories, and there's lots of different answers about how that operates. And certainly Ruth is a pushback against particular ideas about how things are supposed to work and how God works in all of those, because that's the whole story of Ruth, is that God is operating. God, who's really not mentioned, operating through this figure of Ruth, who is the heroine of that story and shouldn't be for any cultural reasons. Any other questions from last week? We're just kind of carrying over from last week that about same-sex relationships, what the Bible has to say about same-sex relationships. before we move on to money? No? We're all good? Okay. I do want to say one more thing about last week's topic, which is to say that I think Amy Jill Levine, in particular, of scholars that are out commenting on this right now, does a really, really good job of saying, I understand how someone could pick a Bible up, like off that table back there, and read it in a particular translation and come away with the belief that same-sex relationships are bad. I understand how they could do that. There's lots of other subjects that are the same way, but we don't treat them the same way. We allow that there's complexity to... so here's the perfect example. Also in Leviticus are all these rules about what you can eat and not eat. The kosher rules about eating, right? Which an evangelical Christian who is supportive of an anti-gay reading of Scripture might say, yeah, but Jesus did away with that. Jesus said, it's not what goes into your mouth, but what comes out of you. So the dietary laws don't count anymore, which is kind of silly at its face, because that's a stretch for that interpretation, and you have to also put that in context of what he was talking about at that point. But what I really want to say is, okay, well, Jesus also said nothing about same-sex relationships. Did not say one word about how you should, if this is to be our pivotal, one of our culture-shaping issues that is literally tearing churches apart, doesn't it feel like the person we all profess to be following should have said something about that? People around him, people within his spiritual ancestry, apparently said things about that, but he did not. And in fact, as long as we're inferring things like we are with the food law changes, as long as we're inferring things, from what other position do you infer other than Jesus encountering all kinds of people who are equally ostracized and saying, you're forgiven, God loves you, go and sin no more? Now, that's not necessarily a position that I want, but how much better a world would we have for our queer siblings if the evangelical church just took the approach of go and sin no more? Just took the approach of tolerance. Just to say, well, who am I to judge? Go and sin no more. If they just took the position of the previous pope, whose position was that? Like, was he going to change things in terms of the structures and the process and the laws that the church has? No, he didn't do that. But he did say, we have to have a different heart about this. And that's where it begins, with us having a different heart about this. It's not that you change the law and that changes your heart. If that were the case, the civil rights legislation would have changed this country in ways that we clearly know it has not. Because we didn't change hearts, we just changed the law. So, that's my little disclaimer before we move on to what does the Bible have to say about money. And this will also be a case for us talking about money and talking about really how we use money. And those, so how do we talk about our hearts as well as our actions? Money is mentioned in somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 verses, depending on how you interpret that, which discuss either money or wealth or possessions or the use of those or the impact of those, directly or indirectly, somewhere around 2,000 to 2,500. About 15% of Jesus' teachings focus on financial topics. It was one of the most talked about subjects and for Jesus, who often uses economic metaphors in his parables. You'll hear one today in church. We are told to avoid the love of money, to choose God over money, so we can be generous and we can be ready to give and put our trust in God, not in riches. So we're going to look at a few of the passages that are out there. So we'll start first with Proverbs 21:20. And so when somebody finds that, if you would like to read that out, you get to be handed the mic and read the passage. You lucky devil. Got it. Brian's got it. Oh, that's you. Oh, okay. Just responding to lucky devil. Proverbs 21:20. Proverbs is in the Hebrew Bible. It comes after the Psalms. Got it?
Okay, what I've pulled up was precious treasure and oil are in the dwelling of the wise, but a foolish man swallows it up.
Yep. Okay. Anyone else have any different interpretation? Different translation? Yeah.
King James, as usual, because it's not that I love King James, I just like to see how stinking different it is.
It is.
There is treasure to be desired and oil in the dwelling of the wise, but a foolish man spendeth it up.
Another good reason to use the King James is that a lot of us grew up, and still people to this day, that's what they hear, right? Anyone else have another translation of that little version?
Let's see. This says, let's see, 21:20. I lost it there for a second. This print is awfully small. Precious treasure remains in a wise man's dwelling, but a foolish man devours it.
Ooh. This is the lesson we're trying to teach our children. Save a little money. Save a little money. Let's see. Do you know what your translation was? Okay. Revised. That is Revised Standard. This is the Inclusive Bible.
Wise people keep a surplus of food and supplies, but fools devour everything they own.
Okay. NIV.
What verse was that again?
21:20.
20. Oh. Sorry, it's little. Okay. That's not it.
21:20.
Probably starts with wise people.
20?
Yes.
Yeah.
In the house of the wise are stores of choice food and oil, but the foolish man devours all he has.
Okay.
I thought the next one was it.
All right. So there's one. Clearly a prescriptive discussion of the resources and your use of resources. Proverbs is all about wisdom sayings. The wise man does this, the foolish man does this. Let's skip way ahead. We'll go to Luke 16:13. This is part of the reading that you'll hear this morning in church. Anyone?
No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth.
Okay. I want to hear that, King James. Because this will be familiar to you.
No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. Ye cannot serve God and mammon.
God and what? Mammon. Anybody know that? God and mammon? That's not familiar to you? You can't serve God and mammon? Oh my gosh. Where are you heathens raised? Oklahoma, yeah. I know, that's why it seems like it should be, it's probably printed on our money somewhere. Yeah. Okay, so that's part of a larger argument in Luke. Again, you'll hear the bulk of that argument in a parable. It's at the end of a parable. But that's a you can't serve two things. Right? The word there, doulos, in Greek, is really slave. And we temper that in some of our modern translations and turn that into servant. But it's really slave.
What does that word mean? I've never heard it.
Mammon?
Yes.
Well, you'll have to wait for this sermon for that. I don't want to, I mean, like you guys will fall asleep if I gotta save something for later. It's a preview. That's right. So let's move on to, so far we have, like, be smart, save a little bit of your resources, right? Don't just eat all that up. And we have, you can't serve both God and money, which is not quite what mammon is, but we'll talk again. 1 Timothy, we'll have a couple of different passages from 1 Timothy. So 1 Timothy 6, which is way towards the end. Anybody have 1 Timothy pulled up yet? Okay.
This is English Standard Version.
Okay.
Let's see. But godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. But if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs.
Ooh. 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 We don't hear that passage brought up at the Chamber of Commerce meetings, do we? Oh. Let's hear from the King.
The version of King James. But godliness without contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain that we can carry nothing out. And having food and raiment, let us be there. This is just fun language.
Yeah.
Let us be therewith content. But they that will be rich fall into the temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through many sorrows.
So I hope, as you're hearing this read over and over, that you're hearing at least a couple of phrases that have made their way into our common vernacular. One is, well, you can't take it with you. right? You've heard that, right? The other is, yes, but that's not what it is. We usually hear money is the root of all evil, but that's not what it says. It says the love of money is the root of all evil, right? That's been shortened a lot, and those are two really, really different statements. And in an economically driven culture in which we find ourselves, a capitalistic culture, those are two like really, really different ways of framing that or thinking about that. Okay? Did you have another version or something?
Yeah, from the message. Just
Okay, well, listen. Okay, so just so you know, before you read that, the Message is not a translation. The Message is something done by a scholar named Eugene Peterson. It's a paraphrase translation, but it's basically, and Eugene Peterson is a lovely guy with a great poetic skill, and it's really beautiful sometimes to read. Just know he's not translating word for word. He's trying to extrapolate interpretation as he reads that. So I don't even use the Message. I don't even say it's a translation. It's a paraphrase.
I just thought it's interesting. Saying the first verse, or two verses, devout life does bring wealth, but it's the rich simplicity of being yourself before God. Since we enter the world penniless and will leave penniless, if we have bread on the table and shoes on our feet, that's enough.
Yeah. So it's how we translate that is really important, because I think Eugene has done something there that is very contemporary. He's taken, can I see your Bible? He's taken that first part, what is it, 6 through 10? Of course, there is great gain in godliness combined with contentment. And he has changed that into there's wealth. He said this is gain. The word is gain. He says wealth. You can be a faithful person and have a lot of wealth. He makes that allowance, which is not necessarily what's in that passage. That's what he's doing with that. Then he colors it with, however, like you have to have all of these other components.
Right. Which is problematic, like the prosperity gospel.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about that in a second too. So 1 Timothy 6, so we move on to verses 17 through 19.
Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way we will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life.
Mm-hmm. Now we gotta hear King, the King. Yeah, because of a particular phrase.
Starting 17. Charge them that are rich in this world that they be not high-minded, nor trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God, who giveth us richly all things to enjoy, that they do good, that they be rich in good works, ready to distribute, willing to communicate, laying up in store for themselves a good foundation against the time to come, that they may lay hold on eternal life.
Mm-hmm. So what's going on? Oh yeah, I am on 2 mics. What's going on in 1 Timothy is that you have an acknowledgement of this wrestling. So first let's put 1 Timothy kind of in context, which is to say that it's a later epistle. It's written probably in the 2nd century, and it's written at a time in which what we now call Christianity is sort of breaking apart from Judaism, and it is becoming a Gentiles-driven religion. And it is within the context of empire. And so it's being spoken to a lot of people who are part of the Roman Empire and a part of an imperial system, which has this relationship to money and wealth and resources. And it seems to be making, it's also a lot of the house church set up, the ecclesias that Paul started when he went out and formed the early, what we call the early church or the early Jesus movement. Those had patrons. So they had to make some sort of allowance for the people who had wealth because they were kind of supporting the institutions that they were developing. And so you see in Timothy this struggle between things, and you see a tension between things. So yeah, there's nothing really wrong with wealth, but it is the love of money. So make sure your love is aimed at the right thing. Do you hear that in that text? Make sure your hearts are in the right place, because if you love money, you will pursue it and not pursue God. And that these are two different paths. That's not said out right, but it's implied in that. Right? Okay. Here. Just so people online can hear you.
So, again, when you look at the world today, where does that message come through about being? It says in this Bible to be liberal and generous and giving. Where did we? I don't hear that being preached on the major. I mean, I don't listen to the major stations, but
but if I did,
doubt very much it's preached on there. But how does one make peace with that if they're going to be literal and cherry pick things out? You would think they wouldn't miss that.
Well, you would think. I will say this is part of our general struggle, friends, is that we all cherry pick. All of us cherry pick. And that's one thing. The second thing is how we read the Bible really matters. If you read it as an instruction manual, then cherry picking becomes a real issue. Well, wait a second. This is all the literal Word of God, and you're supposed to follow all of the instructions. The reality is you can't do that. Because the instructions disagree with each other throughout the Bible. Because it's not an instruction manual. It is a collection of texts, people wrestling with their own experiences of God and trying to figure out what that means and what that looks like. And they're doing that within their own context. So we're back to our struggle from week 1, eisegesis versus exegesis. So are we reading from the text and trying to make sense in our own world, or are we trying to force our own world into the text? And that's a constant challenge we have. So I both want to say you are absolutely correct. In our hyper-capitalist, consumer capitalist world that is also, we are told, part of a Christian nation, this is a real clear deviation where there's some instructions both from Jesus and from later letters about how we should behave economically that we are clearly not adhering to. So where is this tension, right? Where do we, and also, we all do that. So we have to recognize that we all do that. And what the Bible is really calling for, especially in these kinds of passages like right in here, it's talking about what's going on in our heart. So how do you know that somebody loves money more than they love God? Maybe through their actions, right? There definitely is some discernment to be done when you ask that. Now, I know what my answer is. My answer is when you dehumanize another person in order to achieve wealth, you have now shifted your love component, right? If you are not caring for your employees as an employer in a way that allows them to live lives of dignity in order to increase your quarterly profit, there's an ethical, moral, biblical problem with that. We create systems that do that, large systems that do that, and there is an ethical, moral issue when you have 1% of the people holding over 50% of the wealth. Like, I don't know where the line is. I'm not going to say it's totally morally okay for somebody to have $999,999,000.99, but when they become a billionaire, then they're immoral. I'm not going to say that. I don't know what we keep attaching it to the arithmetic of the problem instead of the morality of the problem. There are people who have very few resources and have almost no money who love money more than they love God, right? Who pursue that more than they pursue the ways of God. So that's really, I think, what's going on in the biblical context in terms of what is being portrayed. I wanted us to pay very close attention to not just, it doesn't really give financial advice. It's talking about our relationship to each other and our relationship to money. Right. And then we got to go to John.
This just brings back to mind the really disgusting way that money can be abused, like with the prosperity gospel.
Sure.
All this, the televangelist, and then you find out that they're got, 14 cars and a
Right.
big private jet. And I think I remember Kenneth Copeland said that he had to get a private jet because God doesn't hear you in coach.
That's right.
And it's just flabbergasts me that
Well, it is,
people...
I mean, to be fair, it is very noisy in coach usually.
And also on a different aspect, it comes to economic inequality, how a lot of Americans view poverty as a moral failing.
Right. Right.
When it's, that's
we have
far
to,
from the case.
That's an important descriptor of what we're talking about here. So how do we hold up? So one of the marks of this is indicating, especially in 1 Timothy, is an indication that the person who has all the wealth, think of how often we ascribe, even to the highest office in the land, someone's capacity and capability and skill being attached to the amount of money that they have. We will grant authority to people based on their income, which is not a biblical adherence. The biblical state says it is who you are. If you are generous and kind with your resources, that's the mark of somebody who needs to raise in their level of authority. Right? Did you have? But you're going to do it nonetheless. Go for it. I like it. Just lean in.
I just don't know how to not dive off. as long as I can bounce back off. I can't remember what it was that Violet said that spurred this for me. Oh, we were talking about the prosperity because I was in that world for a while. And there's just something about the belief that the Bible gives you license to selfishness. And that's not how it's perceived. Which perception is my point. That
Okay.
not only
Let's put a
are,
thumbtack in that. Hold on.
not only are we bringing our own assumptions and beliefs and human limited understandings to what we're reading, the people that wrote it.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm going to mention this a couple of weeks ago, when you read some of the magic making assumptions that they made to certain situations, that we would not make those assumptions now. Those are human assumptions based on culture and time and all that.
You bet. So this leans us right into 3 John, but
I just wanted to put the thought out there that regarding poverty, sometimes money is the driver.
Yeah.
Because it is survival.
That's right. Yeah. So when you think about, I thought about that when you when we had the first passage from Proverbs, that the wise man, saves up some stuff and the foolish man consumes everything. When you are raised and live in poverty, resources are to be used. This is the lesson you learn. Resources are to be used because you don't know when you're going to have any again, so you use them. You don't save them. You use that stuff. And that's a very different mindset from people who grow up in some level of abundance, where they learn, oh, well, I can, I'll put some aside, I'll save, I'll do this, because they can do that and still survive and put money away. Whereas people who are in very deep poverty often don't have the resources to even survive. So saving some is a ridiculous notion. So here is this tension, in our own economic system. But before we get too far away from thinking, oh, the prosperity gospel comes out of nowhere, although Tabitha is dying.
I have a question.
Yeah.
It's a slight divergence into the road, but
Okay.
what is the relationship to tithing and prosperity and wealth?
Okay.
Because it talks about giving 10%,
Yeah.
or 0.1% or whatever, however you want to interpret the percentage, but then riches will return to you if you sow greatly.
Right.
So where do we, from a mental health standpoint, where do we diverge that road where it's hey, yes, we're going to give to the world and get riches in return, but we don't want to lean too far into those riches because then that's toxic behavior.
That's right. You see the balance? It's very, very careful. It's very, very careful. And that's in part what we get from trying to make the Bible coherent. I mean, so we try to attach what it gets said in Deuteronomy to what gets said in an epistle from 3,000 years later. We try to make these things connect to each other. And they don't necessarily connect to each other. So, but I do want us to read 3 John 1 through 2, because we're operating under this idea that that this is the only thing the Bible has to say about money. So what is 3 John 1 through 2? You've got it right there. Do you want to?
To the elder, to the beloved Gaius, whom I love in truth. Beloved, I pray that all may go well with you, and that you may be in good health, just as it is well with your soul.
Okay. What was the word there? What word would I want to pull out from there? You have prosper.
Good health in this case.
Yeah. You have prosper. Translations really matter here. Does anybody have anything other than prosper? Okay. What is it? I mean, but what is it? What is, instead, there's a word there that says prosper or something like prosper. What does it say? Just say it.
Even as thy soul prospereth.
prospereth. Yeah, so there's prosper. Yeah. Okay, so this gets held up. Prosper gets held up in what is it? The gospel of prosperity. Right? So this is a passage that it's a greeting to a letter. Like, this is how far we take the literal interpretation. Everything is a instruction, to be used. It's a greeting to a letter. It's, hey, how are you? Hope you're doing well. And that's somehow this instruction. Right? But the word prosper in there gets lifted up as this is God's intention for us. Now, Deuteronomy, which we don't have up on our list right now, but Deuteronomy also gives us this sense that the sign of God's favor is that you are prosperous. How many have read the story of Job? Right? And the story of Job is a pushback against this Deuteronomic thought. The story of Job is that Job is prosperous, and this is a sign of God's favor. Yeah, blessing. Right? And the whole scheme of the story, the start of the story is, oh, well, yeah, this is the adversary coming and whispering to God. Well, sure, Job is very faithful and loves you so much, but it's because he's so prosperous. Take away the prosperity, and his faith will fade as well. All right, that's the whole premise of that story. And his friends who come to converse with him are operating under that same framework. If you are down and out, it is because of some moral failure, right? This is what gets said about people in poverty all the time. It is because of some moral failure that you've done. Otherwise, you'd have God's blessing. We don't talk in the inverse about people who have vast amounts of wealth and are clearly morally questionable, who demonstrate that, who even in our system have it proven in a court of law. Right? So how do we hold those? Well, is that a sign of God's blessing? Somebody over here. Kathy, did you have a...
I was kind of wondering about the word prosper because my thinking is it's not necessarily financial, but
it isn't.
In this definition, which I don't know where it came from, it can mean successful in financial terms, but it also flourish physically, grow strong and healthy.
Right.
So there are a lot of ways you can prosper.
That's right.
That aren't necessarily
financial
to give you wealth.
Yeah, which is why the NRSV chose to translate that as health. That was the word you had. I hope that you are in good health. Right. That all may go well with you. Right. Yes, right. So it's really wanting to make this clear. This is not a financial prospering, this is something else. Because of Common English Bible is one of the more recent translations, so it's aware of all of the use. Right? So one of the earliest documents we have in the Jesus following movement, not before Proverbs, but before all of these, is a book called the Didache, or the Teaching. That's Greek for the teaching. All kinds of instruction for individual and community development. It seemed to be kind of somewhat of an instruction manual for new church plants in our vernacular. So its instructions around resources are quite interesting. This would be the middle of the 1st century. 1, you share everything with each other. Nothing is personally owned. Right? The whispers are already starting. The eisegesis is already starting. It's communism. That was developed by guys much later than this, but yes, I understand the drive to make a political assertion about that. This is also what you get from the book of Acts. That the early followers of Jesus shared all of their resources and gave to whoever was in need. 2, you welcome all people and you give to whomever asks you, which is also an instruction out of the Gospels. 3, you don't pay the teachers and prophets. You feed them and you take care of their needs, but you do not pay them. I am not crazy about this instruction at all. I think it's wrong. It's just wrong. Flat out wrong. In fact, one way you identify a false prophet or a teacher is that they ask for money. Dun, dun, dun. That's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah. So this is some of the earliest instructions about a very different approach to money, and I want us to consider that though it doesn't, it has some kind of revolutionary tinges to us, that in the context in which they were living, this was an absolute flip of everything. And the notion that you would engage in this way with other people, that you would do this across tribal and cultural lines, that you would welcome whoever and you would share with whoever, that you would do all of that stuff, is antithetical to sort of the Roman imperial ideals. So the other thing, I'm not sure, are you raising your hand or are you not raising your hand?
I'm afraid to ask it, but I'm going to go ahead and be bold.
Okay, well here, let me give you this.
Okay. So my understanding was when the Jesus movement started, it was not a career. But now we have careers based on the Jesus movement and those proclaiming to be of that. So how can you balance the just feed them and give them shelter to the 21st century interpretation of what it means to be a preacher, pastor, reverend, yada, yada,
Yep.
yada, yada?
Well, if you're asking me personally...
No, I'm just saying to apply that idea to now.
Yeah. So you can't. These are two different contexts for sure. So it's not apples to apples. That's one thing. That's one way to say that. That even saying that feels a little self-serving. Comments on this would feel a little self-serving. There are days in which I can make that totally work, and I can say, well, institution, this is how we've shaped these things, and I'm doing this within the confines of a capitalist system. That this is how we've sort of orchestrated things and put things together. And there are other days that I think this is morally wrong. I should not be leading this congregation in the way that I'm leading this congregation. We should not have a structure that is set up like this. I should be, like Paul, tent making, what they call tent making. I should earn my living doing other things and then come in and do this, out of my own sense of call to that. And and then there are days where I'm somewhere in between all of that stuff. But it is a very big dichotomy in the same way that I think you see in these passages. This struggle between love of money, but, money's okay, but how do you, like in our capitalist system, how do you get money if you're not pursuing money? And then if you're pursuing money, you're not pursuing God. But if you have money, then you should give it in this way and be generous. But then we want you to keep doing that because the generosity helps these people. So go pursue money again. it's this very, very complex thing. And we really want to have a simple instruction, don't we? Do this or don't do this. That's what we want, and that's not the way life works. So we make that decision, and what decision we make one week in one particular example may be different the next week in a different setting, in a different context. We have to kind of constantly discern and wrestle with those things. Sometimes we make good decisions, and sometimes we don't. And I say all of this with the advance warning that this is a stewardship sermon coming up. So you all have heard my struggle with the very system that I'm getting ready to argue for. Yeah, and it's a problem. It's a problem. As is our relationship to the entire system in which we find ourselves. So we have in our capitalist culture a connection to something that is central to how we operate. What happened this last week economically, Kathy? What happened this last week economically at the Fed? What did the Fed do?
Reduce the interest rate.
By a quarter point, right? Why would that matter? Why should we even have that if we were a Christian nation that paid attention to our scriptures, which has very, very clear instruction on usury and debt? This is not to exist from a biblical perspective. You are not to charge interest. Now, there's a little wiggle room in Hebrew context that you could charge interest to people outside your tribe, but I don't know what that means in our context. But you look throughout Exodus and Deuteronomy and Leviticus, you even look into Luke and back into 1 Timothy, and you have these instructions to not put people in the debt trap. You'll hear it in the parable today that you hear read. All right, so you probably can't read it. It says, turns out poor people with bad credit can't afford to buy a home. Who knew? Right. Think about the immorality of a banking system collapse, a mortgage collapse that occurred just a few years ago that was devastating. Entirely, completely, 1,000% driven by people who were pursuing the love of money at the cost of, I don't care. Don't care what happens to these people.
What if the Bible is about distributing justice?
So the Bible's about a lot of things. That's our problem. Yeah, we've got 1 minute.
Okay. I've always wondered why there was so much jealousy toward the Jewish people. But if they adhere to a belief that you don't take on debt, that allows for a lot of prosperity.
It does.
Naturally.
It does. And listen, nobody's free from this. It's not, this was the same prohibition against usury within Islam. And there are plenty of Muslims who charge interest. And I know several Muslims who have businesses where they loan money and they don't charge interest. And they don't do that because they're commanded not to. We have all kinds of a mix of things going on. And so my final question to you is the biblical viewpoint that the love of money is the root of all evil, or that God wants us all to be wealthy and prosperous? And the answer to that is yes. The biblical position is both of those things. 1 Timothy 6 and 3 John 1 through 2, Deuteronomy versus Job. What lens do we see contributing to the kingdom more? That's our operative question, because all of these things about money in the Bible are really not about money. They're about our hearts. Next week, what does the Bible say about freedom, which is a very culturally derived word right now? So we'll talk about that next week. See you then.